Welcome back to Verified Fears, the dark corner of YouTube where our fearless family gathers. Tonight, we unlock another chilling page from the forbidden book of nightmares. Each word written in fear, each story waiting for you to live it. If you dare to enter this nightmare, prove your courage by hitting the like button. Our target is just 500 likes. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and become part of the Verified Fears family. Because once you're in, there's no turning back. I never believed in supernatural nonsense until my own voice started warning me about my death in the caves beneath Carter County. My name is Langston, and I was 28 when I made the mistake of thinking I could study acoustic phenomena in Kentucky's limestone caves without encountering something that defied every law of physics I'd learned in graduate school. I was working on my thesis about sound behavior in enclosed geological formations, and the Carter Cave system seemed perfect for my research because of their reputation for unusual echo properties that had never been properly documented by any academic institution. The locals I talked to in the nearby town kept giving me these strange looks when I mentioned going into the deeper cave systems alone. And more than one person warned me about sounds that don't come back right. But I figured they were just trying to spook the college boy with typical mountain superstitions that mixed genuine safety concerns with folklore that had been passed down through generations of people who didn't understand basic acoustics. I arrived at the cave system on a foggy October morning in 2019. Carrying enough sophisticated acoustic equipment to map sound behavior in chambers that hadn't been studied by any university research team, including digital recording devices, frequency analyzers, and sound measurement tools that cost more than most people's cars. The park ranger who processed my research permit kept glancing nervously at his weather reports on a computer screen that seemed to be showing increasingly concerning data. And he finally looked up at me, with genuine worry in his weathered eyes, saying in a slow mountain drawl, "Son, you be real careful down there in those deep hollows where the tourists don't go, because sometimes the mountain talks back to folks, and it don't always say what you expect to hear." I thanked him politely for his concern, but privately dismissed his warning as another example of Appalachian folklore getting mixed up with legitimate safety warnings about the very real dangers of solo cave exploration in uncharted limestone systems. The first day of my research went exactly according to plan, with my expensive digital recording equipment capturing what seemed like perfect examples of how sound waves should behave when traveling through natural limestone chambers of various sizes and configurations. I spent hours documenting echo delays that matched my mathematical calculations almost perfectly, measuring frequency distortions that fell well within the parameters I'd expected based on my theoretical models, and collecting data that I was confident would form the foundation of an impressive thesis that would establish my reputation in the field of geological acoustics. That evening, as I set up my camp just outside the main cave entrance, where I could maintain easy access to my research area, I played back the day's recordings through my headphones and heard nothing but textbook examples of acoustic behavior in enclosed underground spaces, with every echo and reverberation following the predictable patterns that any physics student would expect in similar conditions. The second day changed everything I thought I understood about sound, caves, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. I ventured much deeper into passages that weren't marked on any of the tourist maps or geological surveys I'd studied, following narrow limestone tunnels that seemed to stretch endlessly into the mountain's heart through chambers that grew progressively larger and more acoustically complex as I descended further from the surface. About 3 hours into my exploration, when I was probably several hundred feet underground in areas where no casual visitor had ever set foot, I discovered a massive chamber that didn't appear in any documentation I'd studied. A vast, hollow space with walls that seemed to absorb my powerful LED flashlight beam and acoustic properties that immediately struck me as fundamentally wrong in ways I couldn't initially articulate. When I called out a simple test word, hello, to measure the chamber's acoustic response, the echo that bounced back sounded like my own voice, but distorted in a way that made every hair on my arms stand up and sent ice water through my veins. Instead of hearing the expected hello return with normal delay and frequency shift patterns, I clearly heard my own voice using my exact vocal patterns and speech rhythms, saying distinctly, "Don't go any deeper into this cave system, Langston, because you're not going to survive what's waiting for you down there." The words were crystal clear, unmistakably spoken in my own voice, but containing information and warnings that I absolutely had not spoken into the darkness of that impossible chamber. I stood completely motionless in that underground space for what felt like an eternity, trying to convince myself that limestone formations can sometimes create unusual acoustic effects that might cause delayed playback of sounds, or strange distortions that could make echoes seem like different words, and that my mind was probably playing elaborate tricks on me after hours of isolated underground exploration in unfamiliar territory. I decided to conduct a more systematic scientific test. Speaking clearly and deliberately into my digital recording equipment, while simultaneously measuring the chamber's dimensions and mapping its acoustic properties with the precision instruments I'd brought specifically for this kind of detailed analysis. When I spoke the standard audio test phrase, testing, testing, 1, 2, 3, in a clear, measured voice, the echo that returned immediately was unmistakably my own voice saying, "The main passage you used to enter this chamber collapsed approximately 10 minutes ago, and you're now trapped underground with limited oxygen and no way to call for help." I spun around frantically and directed my flashlight beam toward the tunnel entrance I'd used to access this chamber. But the passage appeared completely stable and unobstructed, showing no signs of any kind of collapse or structural failure that would prevent my exit. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I checked and rechecked all of my recording equipment, absolutely convinced that some kind of technical malfunction or equipment failure was causing me to hear impossible sounds that couldn't have any rational explanation under the known laws of physics. But when I spoke again, asking aloud in growing desperation, "What the hell is happening to my voice in this place?" the response came back instantly in my own unmistakable vocal patterns, saying, "You're going to die down here in the next 20 minutes if you don't start listening to what I'm trying to tell you, because I'm the version of you that didn't get these warnings." The sound was definitely emanating from the deepest, darkest recesses of the chamber, bouncing off walls and formations that I couldn't see even with my powerful lighting equipment. But it was unquestionably my own voice speaking words and conveying information that I had absolutely not spoken into the darkness. I tried desperately to rationalize what I was experiencing by considering every possible acoustic phenomenon that might cause sound distortion, delayed playback of previous recordings, or some kind of bizarre resonance effect that could create the illusion of hearing different words. But my sophisticated equipment showed absolutely no evidence of any technological malfunction or environmental condition that could explain the impossible conversations I was having with my own echo. Against every survival instinct that was screaming at me to leave this nightmarish place immediately, I made the decision to document this scientifically impossible acoustic phenomenon by recording everything that happened and asking direct, specific questions to whatever force or entity was causing my voice to echo back with completely different words and terrifying information about future events. When I asked in a voice that was trying hard not to betray my growing terror, "How do you know my name and what's going to happen to me?" the response came back in my own voice with chilling clarity, saying, "Because I am you, Langston." speaking from 30 minutes in the future when I'm dying alone in the dark, and I somehow found a way to send warnings back through time using these caves' impossible acoustic properties. The echo continued speaking in my own voice, providing detailed, step-by-step directions about how to avoid a specific tunnel that would experience a catastrophic collapse, warning me about critical equipment failures that would leave me trapped in complete darkness, and giving me precise instructions about which passages to take and which seemingly safe routes would lead to dead ends where I would run out of oxygen before anyone could find my body. Every piece of guidance came through in my own vocal patterns, speaking with intimate knowledge about future events that hadn't happened yet, but felt absolutely, terrifyingly true in ways that bypassed and spoke directly to some primitive survival instinct buried deep in my brain. As I followed the echo's increasingly urgent and detailed warnings, navigating through the cave system according to instructions that came from my own voice, speaking from an impossible future, I began to understand with growing horror that I was somehow receiving communications from a timeline where I had not received these warnings, where I had died alone in these caves and had somehow found a way to reach back through time and space using acoustic properties that violated everything I thought I knew about physics and reality. The voice guided me away from passages that looked perfectly safe and well-traveled, warned me about handholds that would break away under my weight at critical moments, and told me exactly when to use my emergency whistle to attract the attention of search and rescue teams that I hadn't even realized were already looking for me on the surface. The most terrifying moment of the entire experience came when my future echo voice suddenly shouted with desperate urgency, "Run right now. Don't ask questions. Just run toward the main entrance as fast as you can move." And within seconds of me following that instruction, I heard the grinding, thunderous roar of a massive limestone shelf collapsing with tremendous force, exactly where I would have been standing if I hadn't immediately followed the warning. The voice continued guiding me through passages that seemed to shift and change in my flashlight beam, leading me along routes that I never would have chosen on my own, and helping me navigate through areas where my maps were completely useless and my equipment couldn't provide reliable guidance. When I finally saw actual daylight filtering through the cave entrance after what felt like an eternity of underground terror, my echo voice spoke one final message that continues to haunt every quiet moment of my life. You survived this time, Langston, but you'll never be the same person you were before. And now you have the responsibility to warn other people about what lives in the deep places beneath the mountains. Because there are things down there that shouldn't exist, but do. I emerged from the cave system to find a full search and rescue team preparing their equipment to enter the caves after me. Because my planned 3-day research expedition had somehow stretched into 5 days that I couldn't account for and had no memory of experiencing, with my absence triggering emergency protocols when I failed to check in at scheduled times. The same park ranger who had initially warned me about sounds that don't come back, Wright took one look at my face and the obvious terror in my eyes, nodded knowingly with the expression of someone who had seen this before, and said quietly, "You heard it too, didn't you, son? You heard the mountain talking back to you." I tried desperately to explain what had happened to me in scientific terms that would make sense to rational people. But when I reviewed my recorded data, my expensive equipment showed nothing but static interference and normal recordings of my own voice, speaking in standard conversational tones, with absolutely no evidence of the impossible conversations that had saved my life in ways I couldn't begin to understand or explain. Now I live with constant tinnitus that sounds exactly like distant echoes calling my name from underground chambers. And sometimes, in perfectly quiet moments, I still hear my own voice whispering warnings about dangers I haven't encountered yet, and providing guidance about decisions I haven't made. I never completed my graduate thesis about acoustic phenomena in cave systems, because I realized that some sounds aren't meant to be studied, documented, or understood by human science. And there are things in this world that exist beyond our ability to measure or explain them using conventional methods. The animals in the Monongahela National Forest stopped blinking at exactly 11:47 p.m. And that's when I realized they'd been watching me for hours. My name is McCoy, and I was 34 years old in June of 1995 when I made what I thought would be a routine assignment photographing the ancient hemlock groves for National Geographic, documenting these magnificent trees before some mysterious blight could destroy them forever. I'd been freelancing for the magazine for 8 years, specializing in endangered forest ecosystems. And this assignment seemed straightforward enough that I planned to spend a week alone in the wilderness, capturing the ethereal beauty of these 1,000-year-old giants that had somehow survived every natural disaster and human encroachment that had claimed most of their kind across Appalachia. The Park Service had given me permits to access restricted areas where tourists never ventured, deep in the forest where the hemlock groves grew so thick that even at midday, the forest floor remained shrouded in perpetual twilight that felt both magical and somehow ominous in ways I couldn't articulate. I hiked into the deepest part of the forest on a new moon night, deliberately timing my arrival to capture the hemlocks in complete darkness using specialized low-light photography equipment that could reveal details invisible to the naked eye. The silence in that ancient grove was unlike anything I'd experienced in years of wilderness photography. A profound quiet that seemed to absorb sound rather than simply representing the absence of noise, as if the massive trees were actively muffling every footstep and breath in ways that made me hyper-aware of my own presence as an intruder in this primordial space. I set up my camp in a small clearing surrounded by hemlocks that towered more than 100 feet above me, their branches so dense and interwoven that they formed a natural cathedral ceiling that blocked out every trace of starlight and created the sensation of being inside a vast, living building constructed entirely from wood and shadows. As I prepared my camera equipment for the night's work, I began noticing small movements in my peripheral vision, tiny shifts and rustling sounds that suggested the normal nocturnal activity of forest creatures going about their nighttime routines. At first, I was pleased by these signs of wildlife activity, thinking that I might be fortunate enough to capture some candid shots of the animals that inhabited these ancient groves, perhaps raccoons or possums foraging for food, or maybe even a deer moving through the undergrowth in that graceful, ghostly way they have in deep forest environments where they've rarely encountered human presence. I adjusted my camera settings to account for the movement I was detecting, using longer exposure times and wider apertures to capture whatever creatures might emerge from the darkness between the massive hemlock trunks that rose around me like natural monuments to some prehistoric age when the world was wild and untouched. But as the hours passed and I continued my methodical documentation of the grove, I began to realize that the movements I was detecting weren't random wildlife activity, but something far more organized and intentional that made my skin crawl with primal unease. Every time I changed positions to photograph a different section of the grove, I caught glimpses of eyes reflecting my camera's flash. Dozens of pairs of eyes positioned at various heights throughout the forest, from ground level all the way up into the canopy, watching me with an intensity and coordination that no natural animal behavior could explain. The eyes belonged to different species that should never have been gathered together in one location. Raccoon eyes and deer eyes, and what looked like bear eyes and smaller creatures I couldn't identify, all positioned as if they were deliberately surrounding my campsite in a carefully planned formation that spoke of intelligence and purpose rather than coincidental nocturnal foraging. When I tried to photograph these watching eyes directly, focusing my powerful camera flash on the locations where I'd seen the reflective glints. The creatures would shift positions with synchronized precision that defied everything I knew about animal behavior, moving in coordinated patterns that suggested communication and planning capabilities that wild animals simply don't possess. I watched in growing fascination and terror as what appeared to be a massive organizational structure of forest wildlife repositioned themselves around my location, with larger animals taking positions closer to my camp, while smaller creatures moved to higher vantage points in the trees, creating what looked disturbingly like a military formation designed to monitor and contain my movements within the grove. The truly horrifying realization came when I noticed that none of these animals were making any of the sounds you'd expect from a forest full of active wildlife. No rustling of leaves or snapping of twigs. No breathing sounds or normal animal vocalizations. Just this oppressive silence, punctuated only by the synchronized movement of dozens of creatures that seemed to be operating under some kind of collective intelligence that coordinated their actions with terrifying precision. I tried to convince myself that I was witnessing some kind of unusual but natural phenomenon, perhaps a response to some environmental trigger that had caused various species to gather in this location. But the longer I observed their behavior, the more obvious it became that these animals were exhibiting intelligence and organizational capabilities that violated every principle of wildlife biology I'd learned in my years of nature photography. As midnight approached, the formation of watching animals became more elaborate and sophisticated, with creatures positioning themselves to cut off every possible escape route from the grove, while maintaining constant visual surveillance of my location from multiple angles that would make it impossible for me to move without being observed. I realized with growing panic that I was essentially surrounded by what appeared to be dozens of forest animals acting as a single, highly organized entity that had been studying my movements and behavior for hours, learning my patterns and preparing for something that I couldn't predict but instinctively knew would be terrible beyond imagination. The moment that still haunts my nightmares came at exactly 11:47 p.m., when every single pair of eyes visible in the darkness suddenly stopped blinking in perfect synchronization, creating the horrifying impression that dozens of individual animals had somehow merged into components of a larger collective consciousness that was now focusing its complete attention on my presence in their territory. The sensation of being observed by this impossible hybrid intelligence was overwhelming and paralyzing, like being examined by something that possessed the combined awareness and predatory instincts of every dangerous creature in the forest while operating according to logic and purpose that human minds weren't designed to comprehend or survive. I tried to pack my equipment and leave the grove immediately. But every movement I made was anticipated and countered by subtle shifts in the formation surrounding me, with animals moving to block potential escape routes before I could even fully commit to attempting them, demonstrating a level of tactical awareness and prediction that suggested they understood my intentions before I'd fully formed them myself. The collective intelligence that seemed to be controlling these creatures was learning from my behavior in real time, adapting its strategy based on my responses and becoming more sophisticated and effective with each passing moment that I remained trapped within the hemlock grove. The animals began moving closer to my campsite in a coordinated advance that maintained their formation while gradually tightening the circle around me. And I could see that many of the creatures were larger than they should have been, with proportions and characteristics that didn't match any species I could identify from my years of wildlife photography. Some of the eyes belonged to animals that seemed to be amalgamations of different species, as if the collective intelligence controlling them had somehow merged different creatures into hybrid forms that combined the most dangerous and effective characteristics of multiple predators into single, impossible beings that existed solely to serve the purposes of whatever force had organized this nightmarish gathering. My escape from the grove happened only because of a brief moment when the collective attention of the watching animals seemed to focus on something else in the forest. Some distraction or priority shift that caused the formation to temporarily lose its coordination and create a gap in their surveillance perimeter. I abandoned all of my expensive photography equipment and ran through that gap with desperate terror, crashing through underbrush and low-hanging branches while being pursued by sounds of movement that suggested the entire forest was following me. Hundreds of creatures moving in coordinated pursuit that gradually fell behind as I reached areas where the hemlock grove gave way to more open forest, where their collective intelligence seemed less effective. I emerged from the Monongahela National Forest 3 days later, dehydrated and traumatized, with no photographic evidence of what I'd experienced, and no way to explain to park rangers or National Geographic editors why I'd abandoned thousands of dollars worth of professional equipment in a restricted area where unauthorized camping was prohibited. The official report listed my experience as a case of wilderness disorientation combined with equipment failure, and my editors at National Geographic quietly reassigned me to urban photography projects that didn't require extended periods alone in remote forest environments. Now, 28 years later, I still can't look at woodland creatures without remembering the synchronized way those dozens of pairs of eyes stopped blinking simultaneously. And I've never returned to any forest environment where ancient trees create the kind of deep wilderness conditions that might harbor collective intelligences that view human presence as a threat to be monitored, contained, and potentially eliminated. Sometimes in quiet moments, I still hear the sound of coordinated movement through underbrush. And I wonder if that impossible gathering in the hemlock grove was an isolated incident, or if there are other places in the deep woods where individual animals have somehow merged into hybrid collective entities that operate according to rules and purposes that human consciousness can't comprehend or survive encountering. I thought the residents of the abandoned coal town were just remarkably well-preserved corpses until I watched them serve dinner at exactly 6 o'clock. My name is Dr. Ulysses, and I was 45 years old in March of 2003 when I made the academic mistake of researching lost Appalachian mining communities without understanding that some places are abandoned for reasons that have nothing to do with economics or geography. I was a professor of Appalachian history at West Virginia University, specializing in the social impact of coal mining on mountain communities. And I'd received a small research grant to document ghost towns that had been erased from most official records when mining companies went bankrupt and left entire settlements to decay in remote valleys where nature was slowly reclaiming what civilization had briefly claimed. The town I'd chosen for my research was called Grafton Settlement, a coal mining community that had thrived from 1923 to 1967, before being completely abandoned when the mine closed, leaving behind a collection of company houses and community buildings that had somehow remained remarkably intact despite 40 years of neglect and exposure to harsh Appalachian weather. I arrived at the settlement on a gray March morning when the late winter thaw was revealing structures that had been hidden under snow for months, creating the perfect conditions for photographing and documenting buildings before spring vegetation could obscure architectural details that would be crucial for my historical analysis. The settlement was located in a narrow valley, accessible only by a logging road that hadn't been maintained for decades. Surrounded by steep hillsides covered with bare deciduous trees that created a natural bowl around the cluster of buildings that had once housed several hundred mining families and their support community. As I parked my vehicle and began unpacking my camera equipment and research materials, I was impressed by how well preserved the buildings appeared, with most structures showing remarkably little damage from weather exposure and vandalism that typically destroys abandoned properties within a few years of being left unoccupied. The first building I entered was what had obviously been the company store. A two-story structure that still contained shelves lined with merchandise that looked like it had been abandoned suddenly, as if the residents had simply walked away from their lives without bothering to collect their belongings or settle their accounts. Canned goods from the 1960s sat in neat rows, their labels faded but still legible, and the cash register drawer was open with coins scattered across the counter, as if someone had been making change when they were interrupted by some urgent event that required immediate evacuation. What struck me as particularly unusual was how clean everything appeared despite 4 decades of abandonment. With very little dust accumulation and no evidence of the animal infestations or weather damage that I'd expected to find in buildings that had been exposed to the elements for so many years. As I moved through the settlement, photographing and documenting each building, I began to notice that all of the structures showed the same pattern of sudden abandonment combined with remarkable preservation, as if the entire community had simply frozen in time at the moment when the last residents departed. Houses still contained furniture arranged as if families were expected to return at any moment, with beds made and dishes stacked in kitchen cabinets and personal belongings scattered throughout rooms in ways that suggested normal daily life, rather than the careful packing and gradual relocation that typically accompanies planned community abandonment. Children's toys were scattered on floors, books lay open on tables as if someone had been reading them moments before, and calendars on walls were turned to March 1967, the exact month when mining operations had ceased and the settlement had been officially abandoned. The most disturbing discovery came when I entered what had been the community center, a large building that served as both church and social gathering place for the mining families, and found that it was set up as if for a community dinner that had been interrupted mid-preparation. Tables were arranged in neat rows with place settings for what appeared to be several hundred people, complete with plates, silverware, and glasses that looked like they had been polished and arranged within the last few days, rather than sitting abandoned for nearly 4 decades. The kitchen area behind the main hall contained pots and pans that appeared to have been used recently, with food remnants that should have decomposed long ago, but instead looked fresh enough to have been cooked that morning, filling the air with aromas that made my mouth water despite the impossibility of finding fresh food in an abandoned building. What made the entire situation infinitely more terrifying was the gradual realization that I wasn't alone in the settlement, that there were other people moving through the buildings around me, but people who weren't quite right in ways that became more obvious as I encountered them directly, rather than just hearing their footsteps and voices in adjacent structures. The first person I saw was an elderly woman hanging laundry on a line behind one of the houses, moving with the mechanical precision of someone performing a familiar routine. But when I approached to introduce myself and ask about the settlement's history, I realized that she was severely decomposed, with gray-green skin hanging loosely from her bones and empty eye sockets that somehow still seemed to track my movement as I backed away in horror. As I moved through the settlement with growing panic and disbelief, I encountered more residents going about their daily routines with the same mechanical precision, all of them in various states of decomposition, but still performing the activities that had defined their lives when they were actually alive decades earlier. I saw men in mining clothes walking toward the sealed mine entrance with lunch pails and tools, their rotting faces showing no awareness that the mine had been closed for 36 years and that they were no longer among the living. Women tended gardens where nothing grew except in their decomposing imagination, sweeping porches that accumulated dust faster than they could clean it, and hanging laundry that would never dry because the fabric was as decomposed as the bodies wearing it. The horror intensified as I realized that these undead residents were not just mindlessly repeating past actions, but were actually aware of my presence and adjusting their behavior to accommodate me as if I were a new neighbor who had just moved into their community. Several of the decomposed residents waved at me in friendly greeting, and a few attempted to engage me in conversation using voices that emerged from throats that had rotted away years ago, creating horrible, rasping sounds that might have been words if vocal cords and tongues hadn't long since decomposed into unrecognizable tissue that somehow still functioned according to the residents' persistent belief that they were still alive and participating in normal community life. The most terrifying moment came at exactly 6 o'clock when a bell rang from the community center, and every decomposed resident in the settlement began moving toward the building for what was obviously a regularly scheduled community dinner, walking with purpose and anticipation despite their advanced states of physical decay. I followed at a distance, morbidly curious about what kind of meal could be served by people who had been dead for decades, and watched in absolute horror as the residents took their assigned seats at tables that had been set for a feast that existed only in their collective delusion of continued life. The decomposed residents went through all the motions of eating an elaborate community dinner, lifting empty forks to their rotted mouths and chewing food that wasn't there while engaging in animated conversations about topics that had been relevant 36 years ago but had no connection to current reality. They discussed mine safety issues that had been resolved decades earlier, gossiped about neighbors who had long since died and been buried in other locations, and made plans for community events that could never happen because the community itself existed only in the shared delusion of people who refused to acknowledge their own deaths. What made the situation absolutely unbearable was when several of the residents noticed me standing in the doorway watching their impossible dinner party, and they began gesturing for me to join them, indicating an empty chair that had obviously been prepared for me at a table where I would be expected to participate in their collective denial of death and decay. The decomposed woman who had been hanging laundry smiled at me with teeth that had fallen out decades ago and patted the chair beside her in a gesture of welcome that was simultaneously touching and revolting, as if she genuinely wanted to include me in their eternal community dinner where the food was imaginary and the diners were animated corpses who couldn't accept that their time among the living had ended long ago. I ran from the settlement as fast as my legs could carry me, abandoning my research equipment and documentation in my desperate need to escape from a place where death had been denied so completely that it had become a form of living hell disguised as nostalgic community preservation. When I reported my experience to university colleagues and local authorities, they found no evidence of any residents in the abandoned settlement, living or dead, and my photographs showed only empty buildings and vacant lots where I had clearly seen decomposed people going about their impossible daily routines. Now, 20 years later, I still receive invitations in my campus mailbox written in handwriting that matches samples from the 1960s, inviting me to return to Grafton Settlement for community dinners and social events that are scheduled for dates that have already passed, as if time itself has stopped functioning normally in that valley where an entire community chose to continue existing rather than accept the finality of abandonment and death. I heard the train whistle every night for 2 weeks before I realized the railway tracks had been torn up in 1943. The same year, 73 workers died in the tunnel collapse. My name is Lucian, and I was 25 years old in September of 2008 when I took a security job with Appalachian Timber Company, patrolling their logging operations in the remote sections of the Great Smoky Mountains, where my grandfather had worked on the old railway line before the war. The job seemed perfect for someone like me who preferred solitude and didn't mind spending long nights alone in the wilderness, walking predetermined routes through areas where the company was harvesting timber from steep mountainsides that required careful monitoring to prevent equipment theft and unauthorized access to active logging zones. What I didn't know when I accepted the position was that my patrol route included the sealed entrance to Tunnel 7, where a catastrophic collapse in 1943 had killed an entire work crew and ended railway operations in that section of the mountains forever. My grandfather had told me stories about working on that railway when I was a child. Back when massive locomotives hauled coal and timber through tunnels that had been blasted through solid rock by crews of men who worked in conditions that would be considered criminally dangerous by modern safety standards. He'd mentioned Tunnel 7 in hushed tones, describing it as the longest and most dangerous passage on the entire line. A quarter-mile bore through unstable granite that required constant maintenance and monitoring because of seepage and structural problems that made every trip through the tunnel a potentially fatal gamble, with geological forces that human engineering could barely control. According to my grandfather, the tunnel collapse had happened during a night shift when a fully loaded locomotive was passing through the passage, and the resulting cave-in had been so complete and massive that the railway company had simply abandoned the entire section rather than attempting the expensive and dangerous excavation that would have been required to recover the buried train and the bodies of the workers who had died with it. During my first week of security patrols, I noticed the sealed tunnel entrance during my regular walking route. Recognizing it from my grandfather's descriptions, even though it had been closed for 65 years and was now barely visible behind decades of vegetation growth that had almost completely obscured the concrete barriers and warning signs that marked the location where the railway line ended abruptly in a wall of collapsed rock and steel. The sight of that sealed entrance filled me with an inexplicable sense of unease that went beyond normal curiosity about historical disasters, as if the mountain itself was radiating some kind of warning about disturbing the site where so many men had died in terrifying darkness when tons of granite had crashed down around a locomotive that had no chance of escape from the collapsing tunnel. On my 8th night of patrol duty, I heard the train whistle for the first time, a long, mournful sound that echoed through the mountains at exactly 11:43 p.m., with the distinctive pitch and rhythm that my grandfather had taught me to recognize as the specific signal pattern used by locomotives approaching Tunnel 7. The sound was unmistakably that of a steam engine operating under full power, complete with the mechanical rhythms of drive rods and the periodic release of steam pressure that created the characteristic breathing pattern of heavy locomotives pulling maximum loads up steep mountain grades. I stood motionless in the forest, listening to sounds that couldn't possibly exist because no trains had operated on that line for more than half a century, and trying to convince myself that I was hearing some kind of acoustic phenomenon caused by wind patterns or distant highway traffic that my imagination was interpreting as railway sounds. But as the nights passed and I continued hearing the same phantom locomotive at precisely the same time during every patrol shift, I began to understand that I was experiencing something that went far beyond acoustic illusions or environmental sounds that could be mistaken for machinery. The train whistle was always followed by the unmistakable sound of a heavy locomotive approaching at high speed, complete with the rhythmic clicking of wheels on rails that grew louder and more distinct as whatever impossible train was running that abandoned line drew closer to the sealed tunnel entrance. I could hear the mechanical sounds of steam engines working at maximum capacity, the hiss of pressure release valves, and even what sounded like voices shouting instructions over the noise of machinery operated by men who had no way of knowing that they were approaching a tunnel that had already collapsed and killed everyone who had tried to pass through it on that fatal night in 1943. The most terrifying aspect of these nightly encounters was that the phantom train sounds seemed to be getting stronger and more detailed with each passing night, as if whatever force was creating this impossible auditory experience was somehow gaining power or becoming more real through my continued exposure to it. I began to hear specific details that no imagination could have created, including the voices of individual crew members calling out technical information about steam pressure and brake settings, the sound of coal being shoveled into fireboxes, and even conversations between workers who were discussing routine operational matters as they approached what they believed was just another passage through Tunnel 7, rather than their appointment with a death that had already happened 65 years earlier. On the 14th night of hearing these phantom railway sounds, something changed in a way that transformed my experience from disturbing auditory phenomena to genuine terror that threatened my sanity and my life. Instead of simply hearing the approaching locomotive from my position in the forest, I found myself standing directly on the abandoned railway line, looking down rusted tracks that appeared to extend infinitely in both directions through a landscape that didn't match the familiar terrain where I'd been patrolling for 2 weeks. The tracks beneath my feet were solid and well-maintained, showing no signs of the decay and vegetation growth that should have been obvious after 65 years of abandonment. And in the distance, I could see the headlight of an approaching locomotive that was definitely real, rather than some kind of acoustic hallucination. As the train drew closer, I realized with growing horror that I was somehow experiencing the events of that fatal night in 1943. Standing on tracks that existed in a different time when Tunnel 7 was still operational and the work crew was still alive and approaching their deaths without any knowledge of the geological instability that would crush them in the darkness ahead. I could see the locomotive clearly now. A massive steam engine pulling a long line of loaded cars and operating with all the mechanical precision of a well-maintained railway system that was functioning exactly as designed, despite being completely impossible, according to everything I knew about the history of this abandoned line. The locomotive passed me without slowing, and I could see the faces of crew members in the cab. Men who looked exactly like the workers in old photographs my grandfather had shown me from his railway days, wearing the same type of work clothes and displaying the same confident competence that came from years of experience operating heavy machinery in dangerous mountain conditions. They waved at me in the casual acknowledgement that railway workers traditionally showed to people encountered along their routes, completely unaware that they were already dead, and that I was witnessing their final journey toward a tunnel collapse that had happened before I was born. I followed the phantom train toward Tunnel 7, walking on tracks that felt solid under my feet despite being impossible, driven by a compulsion that overcame my terror and rational understanding that I was participating in something that violated the fundamental nature of time and reality. As we approached the tunnel entrance, I could see that it was open and operational rather than sealed, with maintenance lights illuminating the passage, and signals indicating normal operational status for what should have been a routine transit through the mountain that connected the railway line to destinations that had been abandoned decades earlier. The moment the locomotive entered Tunnel 7, I heard and felt the beginning of the catastrophic collapse that had killed 73 workers. The grinding roar of unstable granite giving way under geological pressures that human engineering hadn't been designed to withstand. But instead of being crushed by falling rock, I found myself experiencing the collapse from the perspective of every worker who had died in that tunnel. Feeling their terror and confusion as tons of stone crashed down around the locomotive, and understanding with horrible clarity that their deaths had somehow created a temporal loop that repeated their final moments every night at 11:43 p.m. for anyone unfortunate enough to be within range of whatever force kept their tragedy perpetually alive in these mountains. I woke up the next morning, lying beside the sealed tunnel entrance, with injuries that matched historical records of the 1943 disaster, including crushed ribs and head trauma that emergency room doctors couldn't explain since there was no evidence of any recent cave-in or structural collapse in the area where I was found. The Appalachian Timber Company terminated my employment after I refused to continue security patrols in that section of the mountains. and I've never returned to any location where abandoned railway lines might still be haunted by the sounds of locomotives carrying dead men toward disasters that happened before most of the living were born. The air in Mammoth Cave's deepest passages doesn't just kill you slowly. It shows you exactly how everyone before you died while you're dying the same way. My name is Benedict, and I was 31 years old in August of 1987 when I made the fatal mistake of believing that 15 years of cave rescue experience had prepared me to investigate the disappearances of 6 experienced spelunkers who had vanished without a trace in an unmapped section of Kentucky's limestone cave system. I was working as a volunteer coordinator for the Cave Rescue Association, and our team had been called in when the National Park Service admitted they had no idea what had happened to a group of expert cavers who had obtained permits to explore passages that weren't included in any tourist maps or official geological surveys of the region. The missing spelunkers were all highly experienced cave explorers with decades of underground experience between them, making their complete disappearance particularly disturbing because these weren't novice adventurers who might have made rookie mistakes that could explain why they'd failed to return from what should have been a routine mapping expedition in familiar limestone formations. The cave system where the spelunkers had disappeared was located in a restricted area of Mammoth Cave National Park, accessible only through passages that required technical climbing skills and specialized equipment to navigate safely, which meant that casual tourists and inexperienced cavers would never accidentally wander into the areas where the missing team had been conducting their research. According to their filed expedition plan, the 6 cavers had intended to map approximately 2 miles of previously unexplored passages that geological surveys suggested might connect to larger chamber systems that could significantly expand the known extent of the cave network, potentially adding thousands of feet of new passages to what was already recognized as the world's longest known cave system. I entered the cave system alone against standard rescue protocols, carrying enough emergency equipment and supplies to survive underground for several days if necessary, including multiple light sources, emergency oxygen supplies, climbing gear, and communication equipment that would allow me to maintain contact with surface teams until I reached depths where radio signals couldn't penetrate the limestone barriers between underground passages and the outside world. My plan was to follow the route described in the missing team's expedition notes, looking for any signs of what might have happened to 6 experienced cavers who should have been able to handle any normal cave emergency or navigational challenge that the underground environment might have presented. The first several hours of my search proceeded exactly as expected, with clearly marked passages that matched the missing team's route descriptions and showed obvious evidence of recent human activity, including rope anchors and equipment caches that the spelunkers had established to support their mapping work in progressively deeper sections of the cave system. I found their base camp in a large chamber approximately 3,000 feet from the main entrance, complete with sleeping bags, cooking equipment, and detailed maps showing the passages they had successfully explored and documented during the first days of their expedition, before something went wrong in ways that left no obvious clues about what kind of emergency or disaster might have befallen such an experienced and well-equipped team. Beyond their base camp, the cave passages became increasingly complex and technically challenging, requiring advanced climbing techniques to navigate vertical sections and narrow crawlways that would have tested the skills of even expert cavers, but still showing clear evidence that the missing team had passed through these areas successfully and established safety ropes and equipment caches that demonstrated their systematic approach to exploring unknown underground terrain. As I followed their route deeper into the cave system, I began noticing that the air quality was gradually changing in ways that my experience had taught me to recognize as potentially dangerous, with subtle shifts in humidity and temperature that suggested I was approaching areas where normal ventilation patterns might not provide adequate air circulation for safe human habitation. The first clear indication that something was seriously wrong came when I reached a chamber that the missing team's notes described as their final successful mapping location. A vast underground space that extended beyond the range of my most powerful lights and contained geological formations that didn't match any standard limestone cave characteristics I'd encountered in 15 years of underground rescue work. The air in this chamber had a quality that I can only describe as thick and oppressive, requiring noticeably more effort to breathe and creating a sensation of pressure in my lungs that suggested atmospheric conditions that might be approaching the limits of what human respiratory systems could handle without supplemental oxygen. But what made this chamber truly terrifying was the discovery that it wasn't empty, that it contained dozens of perfectly preserved human bodies positioned throughout the space in ways that suggested they had simply sat down and died peacefully, rather than showing any signs of struggle or panic that would normally accompany cave emergencies or life-threatening situations. The bodies were in various states of preservation that seemed to correspond with how long they had been in the chamber, with some appearing to have died recently, while others showed signs of having been there for years or possibly decades, all of them displaying the same peaceful expressions that suggested they had experienced comfortable, painless deaths despite being trapped in an underground environment where death should have been accompanied by terror and desperate attempts to escape. As I moved deeper into this chamber of the dead, examining the bodies and trying to understand what kind of environmental condition could have killed so many people without leaving any evidence of distress or emergency response, I began to realize that the air itself was somehow toxic in ways that created hallucinations and euphoric sensations rather than the painful suffocation that would normally result from oxygen deprivation or exposure to dangerous gases. The atmospheric conditions in the chamber were causing me to experience vivid visual and auditory hallucinations that seemed to show me the final moments of every person who had died in this underground space, allowing me to witness their deaths from their own perspectives and understand exactly how the toxic air had killed them while making them feel peaceful and content rather than afraid. The missing spelunkers were there, of course, sitting in a neat group near the center of the chamber with their equipment arranged around them as if they had decided to take a rest break and had simply never gotten up again. Their faces showing the same serene expressions that characterized all of the other bodies scattered throughout the space. Through the hallucinogenic effects of whatever gases were contaminating the air, I could see and hear their final hours, watching as they had gradually succumbed to euphoric oxygen deprivation that made them feel increasingly relaxed and happy, even as their brain function deteriorated and their bodies shut down from lack of adequate respiratory support. The hallucinations became more intense and detailed as I spent more time in the toxic atmosphere, showing me not just how people had died, but revealing the history of this chamber as a death trap that had been claiming lives for much longer than anyone had realized, with bodies dating back decades, representing cavers and explorers who had discovered this space and succumbed to its deadly atmospheric conditions without anyone on the surface ever learning what had happened to them. I watched the deaths of people from different time periods, seeing how the toxic air had killed them with the same peaceful efficiency, while preserving their bodies in the unique environmental conditions that prevented normal decomposition, and created a museum of perfectly preserved corpses that documented decades of cave exploration disasters that had never been reported or investigated. The most horrifying aspect of these hallucinations was the realization that I was experiencing my own death in real time, feeling the gradual oxygen deprivation that was shutting down my brain function, while simultaneously showing me exactly how the process would progress and how I would join the collection of preserved bodies that filled this underground chamber. The toxic air was killing me slowly and painlessly, while forcing me to watch the deaths of everyone who had preceded me, creating a feedback loop of death experiences that seemed designed to torment dying minds with complete knowledge of their fate, while being powerless to prevent it. My escape from the chamber happened only because my emergency oxygen supplies kicked in automatically when my blood oxygen levels dropped below critical thresholds, providing enough supplemental air to temporarily counteract the toxic effects and restore enough brain function for me to recognize that I was dying and needed to leave immediately. I crawled out of that chamber using emergency breathing equipment that had been designed for exactly this type of cave rescue situation, abandoning my search for the missing spelunkers because I understood that they were beyond any help that rescue teams could provide. The National Park Service sealed the chamber after my report, using concrete barriers and warning signs to prevent other cavers from accessing an area that had killed dozens of people over the decades, without anyone realizing that Mammoth Cave contained sections where the air itself was a deadly trap that preserved its victims while showing them exactly how everyone before them had died. I never returned to cave rescue work after experiencing those hallucinations, because some underground spaces contain horrors that go beyond normal cave dangers and create death experiences that human minds weren't designed to survive or remember. My emergency radio started broadcasting conversations between soldiers who officially died in 1992. Except they were begging me to stop listening, because my signal was forcing them to relive their deaths over and over again. My name is Carlo, and I was 38 years old in November of 2022 when I accepted what seemed like a routine assignment from the State Emergency Management Agency to test radio communication equipment on Signal Ridge in Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains, an area notorious for electromagnetic interference that had been disrupting emergency services communications for decades, without any clear explanation from federal agencies or military installations that might be operating classified equipment in the region. I was working as an emergency communications coordinator with 15 years of experience setting up reliable radio networks in challenging terrain. And this assignment appeared straightforward enough that I planned to complete the equipment testing in a single weekend of camping alone on the ridge, where I could conduct systematic signal strength measurements without interference from civilian radio traffic or urban electromagnetic pollution that might skew my technical analysis. Signal Ridge had earned its name during World War II, when the military had established a radio monitoring station there to intercept enemy communications. And local folklore claimed that the ridge still picked up ghost signals from long-dead radio operators who continued broadcasting decades after their equipment had been dismantled and their posts abandoned. I dismissed these stories as typical mountain superstition mixed with legitimate concerns about unusual atmospheric conditions that could cause radio signals to bounce and reflect in ways that created the illusion of receiving transmissions from sources that no longer existed. But I made note of the folklore because unusual propagation effects might explain some of the communication problems that emergency services had been experiencing in this area. I arrived at the ridge on a cold November evening when atmospheric conditions were perfect for radio testing, with clear skies and minimal weather-related interference that might complicate my signal analysis. And I set up my equipment in a clearing that provided unobstructed sight lines in all directions, while being sheltered enough for safe camping in mountain weather conditions that could change rapidly during late autumn storms. My testing equipment included multiple radio systems operating on different frequencies, digital signal analyzers, and recording devices that would document any unusual propagation effects or interference patterns that might explain why emergency communications had been unreliable in this specific geographic area. The first night of testing proceeded exactly according to my technical protocols, with radio signals behaving as expected for mountainous terrain and showing no unusual characteristics that would suggest equipment problems or environmental factors that could disrupt emergency communications under normal operating conditions. I documented signal strength measurements across multiple frequency bands, recorded atmospheric noise levels, and conducted range tests with base stations located at various distances from my ridge position, collecting data that would help emergency services optimize their communication systems for reliable operation in challenging mountain environments where radio coverage had historically been problematic. But as midnight approached, and I continued monitoring radio frequencies for any signs of the interference that had been reported by emergency services, I began picking up transmissions that didn't match any known radio stations or communication systems operating in the region, voices speaking in military terminology, and using call signs that seemed to belong to units that weren't listed in any current military organization charts or federal communication databases. The voices were discussing tactical situations and reporting status updates using procedures and equipment designations that sounded like they belonged to military operations from previous decades, rather than contemporary communication protocols used by modern armed forces. What made these transmissions particularly disturbing was that they seemed to be responding to my presence on the ridge, with the unknown radio operators mentioning my call sign and equipment specifications in ways that suggested they were somehow monitoring my testing activities and incorporating information about my location and activities into their own communications. I heard references to the civilian operator on Signal Ridge and discussions about temporal interference patterns that were affecting their ability to maintain communication with their command structure, as if my radio testing was somehow disrupting whatever impossible communication network these voices represented. As I continued listening to these phantom transmissions throughout the night, I began to understand that I was somehow intercepting communications from a military unit that had been involved in some kind of classified experiment or operation that had gone catastrophically wrong, leaving the soldiers trapped in a communication loop that allowed them to broadcast, but not to escape from whatever situation had befallen them during their original mission. The voices belonged to men who spoke with the professionalism and technical competence of experienced military personnel, but their conversations revealed growing desperation and confusion about their circumstances that suggested they were dealing with problems that had no solutions according to standard military procedures. The breakthrough in understanding what I was experiencing came when I heard one of the soldiers clearly state the date as November 15, 1992, exactly 30 years before my current testing date, and begin describing a classified experiment involving temporal communication research that had been conducted on Signal Ridge during the early 1990s using equipment that was designed to test whether radio signals could be transmitted across time as well as space. According to the fragmentary information I was able to piece together from their transmissions, the military had been attempting to create a communication system that could coordinate operations across different time periods, allowing commanders to receive intelligence reports from future reconnaissance missions and send strategic information back to past operations. But something had gone wrong with their temporal communication experiment in ways that had trapped the entire research team in a time loop that forced them to relive the same day repeatedly. November 15th, 1992. While being unable to escape from the experimental chamber where they had been conducting their tests when the equipment malfunctioned and created conditions that violated the normal flow of time, the soldiers were experiencing their deaths over and over again as the temporal experiment failed catastrophically. But they retained awareness of their situation and could communicate with anyone who operated radio equipment on the same frequency that their experimental system had been using, when it trapped them in an endless cycle of dying and being reset to the beginning of their final day. The most horrifying aspect of intercepting these impossible transmissions was the gradual realization that my radio testing was somehow making their situation worse, that my signals were interfering with whatever delicate balance allowed them to exist in their temporal prison and causing them to experience even more intense versions of their deaths each time the loop reset. I heard them begging me to stop transmitting, explaining that my radio signals were amplifying the effects of their failed experiment and forcing them to relive increasingly painful and extended versions of their final moments when the temporal communication equipment had exploded and killed everyone in the experimental facility. But even as I understood that my continued radio operation was causing suffering to men who had been dead for 30 years, I found myself unable to stop listening to their transmissions. Compelled by a combination of scientific curiosity and horrified fascination with proof that time itself could be broken by human technology in ways that created hell dimensions where the dead were forced to experience eternal repetition of their worst moments. The soldiers continued broadcasting throughout the night, describing in increasingly graphic detail how their temporal experiment had killed them, and how my radio interference was making their deaths more brutal and extended with each repetition of the loop. As dawn approached, the transmissions became more desperate and accusatory, with the trapped soldiers blaming me for prolonging their torment and demanding that I destroy my equipment and leave Signal Ridge immediately before my continued radio testing could cause even more damage to the temporal barriers that were barely containing their failed experiment. They warned me that other people had operated radios on the ridge over the past 30 years, and that each incident of radio interference had made their situation progressively worse, while also increasing the risk that their temporal prison could break down completely and release the same time distortion effects that had killed them into the present day, where it could trap other people in similar loops of endless death and resurrection. The final transmission I received before my equipment mysteriously failed came from what sounded like the commanding officer of the trapped unit. A man whose voice carried the authority and composure of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions under extreme pressure, but who was pleading with me to have mercy on soldiers who had died serving their country and deserved to be allowed to rest in peace, rather than being forced to suffer eternal repetition of their sacrifice because of civilian radio operators who didn't understand the consequences of their actions. He explained that my continued transmission was preventing their souls from accepting death and moving on to whatever comes after life, trapping them in a technological purgatory where they experienced all the pain of dying without any of the release that death should provide. When my radio equipment shut down completely at exactly sunrise, I found that all of my recording devices had been wiped clean, and my signal analysis equipment showed no evidence of having received any transmissions during the night, leaving me with no proof of the impossible conversations I had intercepted, except for memories that felt too detailed and specific to have been hallucinations or dreams. Within hours of my equipment failure, I was contacted by federal agents who confiscated all of my gear and informed me that my emergency management contract had been terminated due to security concerns related to my presence in a restricted area where classified research had been conducted decades earlier. I never returned to Signal Ridge or accepted any other assignments involving radio testing in areas where military experiments might have taken place, because I understood that some technologies create problems that persist long after the original research has been abandoned, and the people responsible for the disasters have died and been forgotten by everyone except the victims who remain trapped in the consequences of their scientific ambitions. Sometimes, late at night when I'm alone with radio equipment, I still hear faint voices calling my name and asking me to help them find peace. But I've learned that some requests for help are beyond the ability of the living to provide. And the best mercy we can offer to the dead is to leave them alone in whatever strange dimensions our failures have created for their eternal suffering. The starving man I rescued from the blizzard had been eating pieces of himself for 3 days before I realized he wasn't the only thing he'd been consuming in those mountains. My name is Colson, and I was 52 years old during the February blizzard of 1998. When I made the mistake of believing that basic human compassion and mountain hospitality could overcome whatever evil had transformed a fellow human being into something that should never have been allowed inside my family's hunting cabin in the remote Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania. I'd been working as a park ranger for 28 years before I retired to maintain the cabin that my grandfather had built in 1934, spending my winters in complete isolation 60 miles from the nearest town, living off supplies I stockpiled each autumn and enjoying the profound peace that comes from being completely cut off from civilization during the months when heavy snow makes the mountain roads impassable to all but the most determined travelers with specialized equipment. The blizzard that brought my unwanted visitor had been building for 3 days, dropping more than 4 feet of snow and creating whiteout conditions that made travel impossible even for someone with my decades of experience navigating mountain weather. So I was surprised to hear someone pounding desperately on my cabin door during the worst part of the storm, when any rational person would have sought shelter rather than attempting to move through terrain that had become completely impassable. When I opened the door, I found a man who appeared to be in his 40s, wearing inadequate clothing for the brutal conditions and showing obvious signs of severe frostbite and malnutrition that suggested he had been lost in the mountains for several days without proper supplies or shelter. The stranger was barely conscious when I brought him inside, mumbling incoherently about being separated from his hiking companions during the early stages of the blizzard and wandering through the forest for days without food while trying to find his way back to civilization in weather conditions that had steadily worsened until he could no longer determine direction or distance in the endless white landscape that had transformed familiar terrain into a featureless maze of snow-covered obstacles. I helped him out of his frozen clothing and into warm, dry garments from my emergency supplies, then prepared hot soup and coffee to treat what appeared to be advanced hypothermia and dehydration that could have killed him if he had remained exposed to the elements for much longer. As my unexpected guest recovered from his ordeal over the course of the first evening, I noticed several things about his condition and behavior that struck me as unusual, but not necessarily alarming, given the trauma he had obviously experienced during his time lost in the wilderness during one of the worst blizzards in decades. He seemed unusually hungry, consuming enormous quantities of food with desperate intensity that went beyond normal appetite. And he displayed nervous habits like constantly checking the windows and doors as if expecting something to follow him to the cabin. But I attributed these behaviors to the psychological effects of his survival ordeal and the natural anxiety that comes from nearly dying alone in hostile wilderness conditions. What began to concern me was the discovery that my guest had been carrying a backpack containing personal items that appeared to belong to multiple different people, including identification cards, cameras, and camping equipment that showed signs of having been used recently, but bore names and photographs of individuals who clearly weren't the man currently sharing my cabin. When I asked him about these belongings, he became evasive and claimed that he had found the items scattered throughout the forest, apparently abandoned by other hikers who had become lost during the blizzard. But his explanations were inconsistent and seemed designed to deflect further questioning about how he had acquired possessions that suggested more sinister circumstances than simple discovery of lost property. The first clear indication that something was seriously wrong came on the second night, when I woke to sounds of movement in the kitchen and discovered my guest consuming raw meat that he had taken from my freezer, tearing into frozen steaks with his bare hands and teeth in a feeding frenzy that was completely inhuman in its intensity and desperation. When he noticed me watching, he tried to explain that his ordeal had left him with unusual cravings and that the extreme hunger caused by his survival experience made it impossible for him to wait for food to be properly prepared. But the way he was eating looked nothing like normal human consumption and everything like the feeding behavior of a predatory animal that had been starved beyond the point of maintaining any civilized behavior. As the days passed and the blizzard continued to trap us together in the cabin, I began to notice that my guest was displaying physical changes that couldn't be explained by recovery from hypothermia and malnutrition, including rapid healing of frostbite damage that should have required medical treatment and weeks of recovery time, and alterations in his facial features and body proportions that seemed to be occurring too quickly to be natural healing processes. His fingernails were growing at an abnormal rate and becoming more claw-like in appearance. His teeth seemed to be getting sharper and more prominent, and his eyes had developed a predatory focus that made me increasingly uncomfortable whenever he looked at me directly. The horror of my situation became undeniable when I discovered human remains hidden in the woodshed behind my cabin. Body parts that had been carefully butchered and stored as if they were game meat, rather than the remains of human beings who had presumably been the hiking companions my guest had claimed to have lost during the blizzard. The evidence suggested that he had not been a victim of the storm, but rather a predator who had been hunting other travelers in the mountains, killing and consuming them with methodical efficiency that indicated this was not his first experience with cannibalism, but rather a pattern of behavior that had become his primary means of survival during extended periods in the wilderness. When I confronted him with the evidence of his cannibalistic activities, the pretense of civilized human behavior dropped away completely, and I found myself face to face with something that had once been human, but had transformed into a creature that existed solely to hunt and consume other people, driven by hungers that went far beyond normal appetite, and had become the defining characteristic of an existence that was no longer recognizably human. He explained with calm, matter-of-fact detachment that the transformation had begun during a previous winter when he had become lost in the mountains and had been forced to consume human flesh to survive, but that the act of cannibalism had triggered changes in his body and mind that made it impossible for him to return to normal food or normal human social relationships. The creature that had once been human described how the consumption of human flesh had given him enhanced strength, speed, and sensory capabilities that made him a more effective predator, but had also created an insatiable craving for human meat that could never be satisfied by any other type of food, condemning him to an existence of perpetual hunting and killing that had gradually stripped away every aspect of his former humanity until nothing remained except the biological imperative to feed on his own species. He told me that he had been surviving in the mountains for more than a decade, preying on hikers and campers who ventured into remote areas where their disappearances would be attributed to natural disasters or wilderness accidents rather than predation by something that should not exist according to modern understanding of human psychology and biology. What made his confession infinitely more terrifying was his explanation that the cannibalistic transformation was progressive and irreversible, that each act of consuming human flesh made the changes more pronounced and permanent, while simultaneously making it impossible to derive any nutrition or satisfaction from normal food sources, creating a biological dependency on human meat that functioned like an addiction, except that the withdrawal symptoms included not just psychological craving, but actual physical deterioration that could only be prevented by continued predation on other people. He had become something that existed in the liminal space between human and monster, retaining enough of his original personality and intelligence to function in social situations when necessary, but driven by biological imperatives that made it impossible for him to coexist peacefully with the human society he had once been part of. The most horrifying aspect of his transformation was that it was contagious in ways that went beyond simple psychological influence, that prolonged exposure to his presence was beginning to affect my own thoughts and appetites in ways that suggested the cannibalistic curse could be transmitted to others through proximity and shared living conditions. gradually breaking down the psychological and biological barriers that normally prevent humans from viewing their own species as potential food sources. I began experiencing intrusive thoughts about human flesh as a food source. Found myself studying his feeding techniques with fascination rather than revulsion, and noticed that normal food was beginning to seem inadequate and unsatisfying in ways that paralleled his own descriptions of the progressive inability to derive nutrition from anything except human meat. My escape from the cabin and from the transformation that was beginning to affect my own humanity happened only because the blizzard finally broke after 8 days, allowing me to leave on snowshoes while my cannibalistic guest was sleeping off one of his feeding sessions. But not before I had experienced enough of the psychological changes to understand that his condition was indeed transmissible, and that I would need to remain isolated from human contact until I could be certain that the contagious aspects of his cannibalistic transformation wouldn't spread to others through my continued presence in civilized society. I burned the cabin to the ground from a safe distance, ensuring that nothing remained of the contaminated environment where a human being had been transformed into something that fed on its own species. And I reported the incident to authorities as a propane explosion that had occurred during the blizzard, providing no details about my cannibalistic guest or the evidence of his predatory activities that had been destroyed in the fire. 25 years later, I still live in isolation, monitoring myself for signs that the cannibalistic transformation might still be progressing within my own biology and psychology. Because some hungers, once awakened, never completely disappear, but instead wait for moments of weakness or desperation when civilized behavior becomes insufficient to suppress the biological imperatives that connect us to our most primitive and monstrous ancestors. The storm shelter I found during the tornado warning wasn't just alive. It was digesting the 17 people who had taken refuge there before me. My name is Mayer, and I was 29 years old in April of 2016, when I was pursuing my graduate degree in meteorology while working as an amateur storm chaser, documenting severe weather phenomena across the Midwest and Appalachian regions for my thesis research on supercell formation patterns in mountainous terrain that could contribute to scientific understanding of how topographical features influence tornado development and intensity. I had been tracking a particularly dangerous storm system moving through the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas, following weather patterns that suggested the formation of multiple tornadoes with the potential for significant damage to the scattered rural communities that dotted the remote valleys where early warning systems were often inadequate, and emergency shelter options were limited by the challenging terrain and sparse population density. The tornado warning that changed my life forever was issued at 3:47 p.m. on April 23rd, when Doppler radar showed a massive supercell with clear rotation signatures moving directly toward my location along a country road where I had positioned myself to photograph the storm's approach. But the meteorological conditions deteriorated so rapidly that I found myself in immediate danger from what appeared to be multiple tornado touchdowns occurring simultaneously across the valley where I had been conducting my research. My weather monitoring equipment was registering atmospheric pressure drops and wind speed measurements that indicated an extremely violent storm system with the potential to produce EF4 or EF5 tornadoes that could be fatal to anyone caught in the open without adequate shelter, forcing me to abandon my research activities and seek immediate emergency protection from weather conditions that had become life-threatening within minutes. I had been driving through increasingly rural areas in search of better positioning for storm photography when the tornado sirens began wailing across the valley, and I realized that I was too far from any official emergency shelter to reach safety before the storm system arrived, leaving me with no choice but to search for any available structure that might provide adequate protection from the catastrophic winds and debris that were already beginning to tear through the forested hills around me. The abandoned homestead where I found the root cellar appeared to have been deserted for decades, with a collapsed farmhouse and overgrown fields that showed no signs of recent human habitation. But the underground storm shelter looked solid and well-maintained despite the deterioration of the surface structures that had once comprised a working farm operation. The root cellar entrance was partially hidden by vegetation that had grown over the concrete and steel construction, but the door was easily opened and revealed a staircase leading down into what appeared to be a spacious underground chamber that had been designed specifically to provide protection during severe weather events. Complete with ventilation systems and storage areas that suggested it had been built to shelter multiple families during the tornado seasons that regularly threatened rural communities throughout this region of Arkansas. As I descended into the shelter, I was impressed by how well preserved the interior appeared despite the obvious age of the construction, with walls and ceiling that showed no signs of water damage or structural deterioration that might compromise the safety of the underground refuge. But as I settled into the root cellar to wait out the tornado that I could hear approaching with the characteristic freight train roar that indicates extremely dangerous wind speeds, I began to notice aspects of the shelter that struck me as unusual and progressively more disturbing the longer I remained underground, listening to the storm pass overhead. The walls had a texture that seemed organic rather than constructed, with surfaces that appeared to have a subtle movement or pulsing quality that might have been caused by changes in air pressure from the storm above, but which created an unsettling impression that the shelter itself was somehow alive and responding to my presence in ways that underground structures should not be capable of experiencing. The first clear indication that something was fundamentally wrong with my emergency shelter came when I realized that the air inside the root cellar had a quality that was distinctly biological rather than the stale, musty atmosphere that would be expected in an underground space that had been sealed for extended periods, with a humidity and warmth that suggested active respiration or metabolic processes occurring within the walls themselves. The ventilation system that I had initially assumed was providing fresh air from the surface was actually creating circulation patterns that felt more like breathing than mechanical air movement, with rhythmic inhalation and exhalation cycles that coincided with the subtle pulsing movements I had been observing in the organic-seeming wall surfaces. As the tornado passed directly over my location, creating tremendous pressure changes and sound levels that should have been the primary focus of my attention during what was obviously a life-threatening weather event, I found myself becoming increasingly fascinated and horrified by the realization that I was not in a man-made storm shelter, but rather inside some kind of massive living organism that had evolved to mimic human construction while serving as a trap for people seeking emergency protection during severe weather. The root cellar was actually a specialized organ system belonging to an enormous subterranean creature that had positioned itself beneath the abandoned homestead specifically to capture humans who might seek shelter during storms. Using the natural tendency of people to trust underground structures during tornado events as a hunting strategy that provided regular access to prey, the discovery that completely confirmed my horrifying realization came when I found human remains scattered throughout the shelter. Not decomposed skeletons that would indicate accidental deaths from previous tornado seasons, but partially digested bodies in various stages of being processed by whatever biological systems were operating within the creature's digestive chamber that masqueraded as a protective storm shelter. The remains showed clear evidence of having been dissolved by enzymatic processes rather than normal decomposition, with clothing and personal items that indicated the victims had sought shelter during different storm events over a period of many years, suggesting that this creature had been using the same hunting strategy successfully for decades, without anyone recognizing that people weren't just taking shelter, but were actually being consumed by a predatory organism that had evolved specifically to exploit human behavior during natural disasters. The most terrifying aspect of my situation became apparent when I realized that the digestive processes had already begun affecting my own body during the time I had been in the creature's stomach, with my skin beginning to show signs of chemical burns from exposure to the acidic atmosphere that I had mistaken for unusual humidity, and my respiratory system being compromised by enzymes that were designed to break down organic tissue while keeping prey alive and conscious during the extended digestion period that allowed the creature to extract maximum nutrition from each victim. I could feel the biological processes working on my body, dissolving my clothing and beginning to affect the outer layers of my skin, while creating a tingling sensation that would have been almost pleasant if I hadn't understood that it represented the early stages of being eaten alive by something that was patient enough to consume its prey slowly over a period of days or weeks. The human remains I found throughout the creature's digestive chamber included personal belongings and identification that allowed me to piece together the history of people who had sought shelter in this location during previous tornado events, including entire families who had taken refuge together and had presumably died together while being slowly dissolved by the creature's digestive enzymes, experiencing prolonged and horrible deaths while being trapped in an underground environment where their screams and pleas for help would never be heard by potential rescuers searching for tornado survivors. The creature had been feeding on storm refugees for at least 20 years, based on the dates on driver's licenses and other identification I found among the remains, perfecting its hunting technique and growing larger and more sophisticated in its ability to mimic human construction while maintaining the biological systems necessary to process multiple victims simultaneously. What made my situation even more hopeless was the realization that the creature's digestive processes were designed to keep prey alive and conscious for as long as possible. Using a combination of enzymes and atmospheric conditions that prevented death from shock or trauma while slowly breaking down organic tissue in ways that maximized the creature's nutritional intake from each victim, meaning that I would remain aware and able to experience every aspect of being eaten alive over a period that could last for weeks, depending on my body size and the creature's current hunger level. The other victims had left evidence of their prolonged suffering in the form of desperate messages carved into the organic walls, documenting their gradual realization that they were being digested alive, and their unsuccessful attempts to escape from a creature that was biologically designed to prevent its prey from leaving once the digestive processes had begun. My escape from the creature's stomach happened only because the tornado that had driven me to seek shelter had also damaged the creature's external structure in ways that temporarily disrupted its ability to maintain the atmospheric conditions necessary for its digestive processes, creating a brief window during which the enzymes that were breaking down my body became less effective, and the creature's muscular contractions that prevented escape were weakened enough for me to force my way back up the entrance passage that functioned as the creature's throat. I emerged from what I had thought was a root cellar during the height of the tornado, preferring to take my chances with EF4 winds and flying debris rather than remaining trapped in the digestive system of a creature that was slowly dissolving me alive while keeping me conscious to experience every moment of the process. The chemical burns and respiratory damage I sustained during my time in the creature's stomach required months of medical treatment that I could never fully explain to doctors who had no framework for understanding injuries caused by being partially digested by a subterranean organism that masqueraded as emergency shelter. And I've never returned to storm chasing or any meteorological research that might require me to seek emergency shelter in rural areas where similar creatures might be using natural disasters as opportunities to hunt humans. Sometimes during severe weather events, I still have nightmares about underground spaces that breathe and digest. And I wonder how many missing persons cases attributed to tornado casualties are actually people who sought shelter in the wrong places and discovered that some refugees are more dangerous than the storms they're designed to protect us from. I followed my own voice, calling for help through the Cumberland Gap wilderness for 6 hours before I realized I was being led to the place where I was supposed to die. My name is Henrik, and I was 26 years old in July of 2020 when I volunteered to lead my first search and rescue mission for Cumberland Gap National Park. Looking for 3 experienced hikers who had disappeared without a trace in the dense rhododendron thickets that cover the steep mountainsides along the Kentucky-Tennessee border, where the Appalachian wilderness becomes so thick and disorienting that even experienced outdoorsmen can become completely lost within minutes of leaving marked trails. I had recently graduated from college with a degree in wilderness management and had been volunteering with the Park Service for 8 months. But this was my first opportunity to lead an actual search operation rather than simply assisting more experienced rangers. And I was determined to prove myself capable of handling the responsibility that came with coordinating efforts to locate missing persons in some of the most challenging terrain in the eastern United States. The 3 missing hikers were all experienced backpackers from Ohio who had obtained permits for a 5-day wilderness trek through the most remote sections of the park. Following an ambitious route that would take them through areas where few visitors ventured, and where cell phone coverage was non-existent due to the mountainous terrain that blocked radio signals and created dead zones where communication with the outside world became impossible. They had been expected to return to their vehicle on Tuesday evening, but when they failed to appear by Thursday morning and missed their scheduled check-in calls with family members, the Park Service had initiated standard missing persons protocols that began with aerial reconnaissance and progressed to ground-based search teams when helicopter surveys failed to locate any signs of the overdue hikers or their equipment. I began my search operation on Friday morning with a team of 4 experienced volunteers. Following the planned route described in the missing hikers' permit application, while maintaining radio contact with base camp and conducting systematic grid searches of areas where people might seek shelter or become trapped by terrain features that could prevent them from continuing their planned itinerary. The Cumberland Gap region is notorious for its complex topography and dense vegetation that can completely hide large objects from aerial observation, making ground-based searches the most effective method for locating missing persons despite the time-intensive nature of systematically covering thousands of acres of wilderness, where visibility is often limited to a few feet in any direction. The first indication that this search operation would be different from standard missing persons cases came when we began hearing voices calling for help from multiple directions. Simultaneously, voices that seemed to belong to the missing hikers but were coming from locations that were geographically impossible, given the acoustic properties of the terrain and the distances between our team members who were spread out across the search area. The voices were clearly human and obviously distressed, calling out the names of the missing hikers and providing location information that suggested they were trapped or injured in areas that we had already searched thoroughly without finding any evidence of human presence or activity. What made these voice contacts particularly disturbing was that they seemed to be responding to our radio communications and search activities in real time, providing information about our movements and positions that suggested the speakers had visual contact with our team despite being completely invisible to us, and calling out warnings and requests for help that became increasingly urgent and specific as we attempted to triangulate their locations using standard search and rescue techniques. The voices knew details about our search operation that should have been impossible for stranded hikers to possess, including the names of team members and specific equipment we were carrying, as if they were somehow monitoring our communications and activities from positions that allowed them to observe us without being detected. As we continued following these voice contacts deeper into the rhododendron thickets, where visibility was reduced to arm's length and navigation became extremely challenging, even with GPS equipment and topographical maps. I began to notice that the voices were displaying characteristics that didn't match normal human speech patterns or the expected behavior of people who were genuinely lost or injured in wilderness conditions. The calls for help were perfectly enunciated, despite supposedly coming from people who had been missing for several days without adequate food or water. And the speakers seemed to have unlimited energy for shouting despite the physical exhaustion that would normally affect anyone who had been lost in challenging terrain for extended periods without proper supplies. The most unsettling aspect of these phantom voices was that they began to include perfect mimicry of my own voice and the voices of my team members, calling out our names and repeating conversations we had just had, while supposedly providing directions to locations where the missing hikers were waiting for rescue. But when we followed these audio instructions, we found ourselves being led away from our planned search areas and deeper into terrain that was progressively more difficult to navigate, and farther from the marked trails that would allow us to maintain our bearings and return safely to base camp if weather conditions deteriorated or emergency evacuation became necessary. By mid-afternoon, I realized that we had been following false voice contacts for more than 4 hours and had covered several miles of extremely challenging terrain while making no progress toward locating the actual missing hikers, and that our attempts to respond to the calls for help were actually taking us farther away from areas where lost people would logically seek shelter or assistance, leading us instead toward remote sections of the wilderness where our own team could easily become lost or trapped by the same conditions that had presumably befallen the people we were trying to rescue. The voice mimicry had become so sophisticated that team members were responding to calls that seemed to come from other team members, creating confusion about our positions and coordination that threatened to split up our search group in ways that could compromise the safety of everyone involved in the operation. The breakthrough in understanding what we were actually dealing with came when I heard my own voice calling for help from a location approximately 50 yards ahead of our current position, providing detailed information about being trapped in a rockfall with serious injuries that required immediate medical attention. But I was obviously with my team and had not been separated or injured during our search activities, making it impossible for my own voice to be calling out from a location where I was not present. The mimicry was so perfect that it included my speech patterns, vocabulary, and even my slight regional accent. But it was definitely coming from a source that was not me, while containing information about injuries and circumstances that were completely fictional, but designed to motivate rescue response from my team members who would naturally want to assist what appeared to be their team leader in a life-threatening emergency situation. When we investigated the location where my voice had been calling for help, we found evidence of previous search and rescue operations that had ended badly, including equipment and personal belongings that belonged to rescue workers who had presumably been lured into the same trap that was currently being used against our team, suggesting that whatever entity was creating these voice mimicries had been using this hunting strategy successfully for years or possibly decades. Preying on the natural instincts of search and rescue personnel who are trained to respond immediately to calls for help regardless of personal risk or situational anomalies that might indicate danger. The abandoned rescue equipment included radio transcripts and written notes that documented previous encounters with the same voice mimicry phenomenon, describing how entire search teams had been led deeper and deeper into the wilderness by phantom calls for help that perfectly replicated the voices of team members, missing persons, and even family members of the searchers, creating psychological pressure that made it almost impossible to ignore the requests for assistance, even when logical analysis suggested that the voices were not genuine human communications, but rather some kind of predatory mimicry designed to separate rescue workers from safe areas and lead them into locations where they could be killed or captured by whatever entity was orchestrating these elaborate deceptions. The most horrifying discovery in the abandoned equipment was a journal kept by a previous search team leader who had documented several days of being pursued through the Cumberland Gap wilderness by voices that not only mimicked human speech, but seemed to possess complete knowledge of the searchers' personal lives, calling out the names of family members and providing intimate details about relationships and experiences that should have been impossible for any external entity to know, creating psychological torture that was designed to break down rational decision-making and force the victims to follow the voices even when they understood that doing so would lead to their deaths. According to the journal entries, the voice mimicry entity seemed to feed on the psychological and physical energy of people who were experiencing extreme stress and terror, using elaborate deceptions to create prolonged periods of fear and confusion that somehow provided nutrition or satisfaction to whatever intelligence was orchestrating these hunting activities, suggesting that the missing hikers and previous search teams had not been killed quickly, but rather subjected to extended periods of psychological torture that served the needs of a predatory entity that existed to cause suffering rather than simply eliminating threats or obtaining food through conventional predatory behavior. My escape from the Cumberland Gap voice trap happened only because I recognized that we were being systematically separated from our base coordinates and led into terrain where emergency evacuation would be impossible. And I made the difficult decision to ignore all voice contacts regardless of how urgent or convincing they sounded, instead following standard search protocols that prioritized team safety over response to unverified emergency calls. But 3 members of my search team continued following the phantom voices despite my direct orders to return to base camp. And they were never seen again, despite extensive search operations that continued for weeks after our failed rescue mission. The official report attributed the disappearances to standard wilderness accidents and navigation errors. But I know that there are things in the Cumberland Gap that use our own voices against us, mimicking our speech and exploiting our natural desire to help others in distress as a way of hunting human beings who venture too far into places where predatory intelligence has learned to imitate the sounds of civilization, while leading us away from safety and toward deaths that serve purposes we cannot understand or escape. Once we start following voices that sound exactly like our own, but belong to something that should not exist in any world where humans expect to survive their encounters with the unknown. The blood at the 1952 crime scene was still wet when I found it in October 2023. And the killer was still there finishing what he'd started 71 years ago. My name is Jariah, and I was 33 years old when I made the mistake of investigating cold cases for my true crime podcast without understanding that some murders create temporal wounds that never heal, trapping both victims and perpetrators in endless loops of violence that repeat across decades until someone unfortunate enough stumbles into the wrong place at the wrong time, becomes part of a crime that happened before they were born. I had been researching Prohibition-era murders in Shenandoah National Park for 6 months, focusing on the violent conflicts between federal agents and moonshine operations that had resulted in dozens of unsolved homicides during the 1920s and 1930s, when illegal alcohol production was a major industry in the remote mountain valleys, where law enforcement presence was minimal and territorial disputes were settled with gunfire rather than legal proceedings. The particular case that led me to my encounter with temporal horror involved the massacre of 7 people at an illegal distillery operation on November 3, 1952. A crime scene that had been discovered by park rangers but never properly investigated due to jurisdictional complications and the reluctance of local authorities to prosecute cases involving illegal alcohol production that provided significant economic benefits to impoverished mountain communities during the post-war economic difficulties. According to the limited documentation available in Park Service archives, The victims had been killed execution style during what appeared to be a territorial dispute between competing moonshine operations. But the case had been closed without any arrests or identification of suspects, leaving it as one of dozens of unsolved murders from an era when violence in the mountains was considered an internal matter that outside authorities preferred to ignore. I had obtained permission to visit the historical crime scene as part of my podcast research. Hiking to a remote location deep in the park where the ruins of the illegal distillery were still visible among the trees. Though 71 years of weather and vegetation growth had obscured most evidence of the criminal activity that had once taken place there. The area was accessible only by unmarked trails that required several hours of difficult hiking through terrain that had changed significantly since the 1950s. With modern environmental restoration having eliminated most traces of the industrial activity that had once made this location valuable enough to kill. For during the violent competition between moonshine producers who controlled different territories throughout the mountain region. When I reached the site of the former distillery operation, I was surprised to find that the crime scene appeared to be in much better condition than I had expected based on the age of the case and the environmental factors that should have eliminated any remaining evidence decades earlier. With structures and equipment that looked like they had been abandoned recently, rather than showing 71 years of deterioration from exposure to weather and natural decay processes. The copper stills and wooden buildings that housed the illegal operation showed minimal rust and rot. And personal belongings scattered around the site included items that appeared to have been manufactured within the last few years rather than representing artifacts from the Prohibition era that should have long since decomposed or been removed by Park Service maintenance activities. The first clear indication that I was experiencing something beyond normal historical research came when I noticed that the ground around the distillery showed obvious signs of recent violence, with dark stains that appeared to be fresh blood soaking into soil that should have absorbed and neutralized any organic material decades earlier, and evidence of gunfire damage to trees and buildings that looked like it had occurred within days rather than representing historical bullet holes that had been healing and growing over for more than 7 decades. The crime scene was not a historical site, but an active location where violence was still occurring according to the same patterns that had been documented in 1952. Suggesting that whatever had happened, there was continuing to happen in ways that defied normal understanding of time and causality. As I documented the impossibly preserved crime scene with my photography equipment and digital recording devices, I began to hear sounds that clearly indicated active criminal operations taking place in the immediate vicinity, including the mechanical noises of distillery equipment operating at full capacity, and human voices engaged in the kind of tense negotiations and territorial disputes that had characterized the moonshine industry during its most violent periods. The voices were using language and expressions that belonged to the 1950s rather than contemporary speech patterns, and they were discussing business matters and personal conflicts that seemed to be directly related to the territorial dispute that had resulted in the unsolved massacre that had originally brought me to this location for my podcast research. The realization that I was somehow witnessing the actual events that had led to the 1952 murders came when I saw living people moving through the distillery operation, men dressed in clothing and using equipment that belonged to the Prohibition era, conducting business activities that should have been impossible in a location that had been abandoned for 7 decades. And was now part of a national park where any kind of industrial activity was strictly prohibited by federal regulations. These were not historical reenactors or park employees conducting educational demonstrations, but actual moonshiners engaged in the same illegal alcohol production that had made this location valuable enough to kill for during the violent territorial disputes that had characterized the industry during its most dangerous periods. The men I was observing seemed to be completely unaware of my presence, despite my obvious anachronistic appearance and the modern equipment I was carrying. as if they were existing in a different temporal dimension that occasionally intersected with the present, but remained fundamentally disconnected from contemporary reality, allowing them to continue their 1952 activities without interference from the changed conditions that should have made their operations impossible in the modern era. They were preparing for some kind of confrontation that they expected to occur at a specific time, checking weapons and discussing defensive strategies that suggested they were anticipating an attack from rival moonshiners who wanted to claim this territory for their own illegal operations. The horror of my situation became undeniable when I realized that the confrontation they were preparing for was the same massacre that had been documented by park rangers in 1952, and that I was about to witness the execution-style murders of 7 people who had been killed more than 70 years earlier, but were somehow still alive and about to die again in a temporal loop that had been repeating the same violent events for decades without any possibility of changing the outcome or preventing the deaths that had already become part of historical record. The moonshiners were trapped in a cycle that forced them to relive their final day over and over again, experiencing the same fear and anticipation that had preceded their deaths while being unable to escape from the fate that had already been determined by events that existed outside normal temporal boundaries. When the attacking moonshiners arrived at exactly the time indicated in the historical records, I watched the massacre unfold with the same brutal efficiency that had been documented in the original crime scene reports, but with the added horror of understanding that this violence was not a one-time historical event, but an eternal repetition of murder that had been occurring regularly for 7 decades, creating a temporal wound in reality that trapped both victims and perpetrators in an endless cycle of preparation, conflict, and death that reset automatically after each completion and began again with the same participants playing the same roles toward the same inevitable conclusion. The most terrifying moment of my entire experience came when the leader of the attacking group, a man whose face matched descriptions in historical documents of the primary suspect who had never been identified or prosecuted for the massacre, noticed my presence during the killing and realized that I was not part of the original timeline, but rather an intruder from a different era who was witnessing events that should have remained hidden in the past. His recognition of my anachronistic status seemed to disrupt the temporal loop that had been containing the violent events, and suddenly I was no longer an invisible observer, but an active participant in a massacre that was happening in real time, despite being historically impossible. The killer began pursuing me through the forest with the same methodical determination that he had used to execute the 7 moonshiners, but with the added motivation of eliminating a witness who possessed knowledge that could potentially disrupt the temporal isolation that had allowed him to escape justice for more than 7 decades by existing in a timeline that was disconnected from normal legal and social consequences for his actions. I realized that my presence in the temporal loop had somehow made it possible for the killer to exist in the present day while retaining all of his memories and motivations from 1952, creating a situation where I was being hunted by a murderer who was simultaneously dead and alive, historical and contemporary, trapped in the past but capable of affecting the present through violence that transcended normal temporal boundaries. My escape from the temporal crime scene happened only when I managed to remove physical evidence from the distillery operation, taking a copper component from one of the stills that seemed to serve as an anchor point for the temporal loop. And the removal of this object caused the entire 1952 scenario to collapse back into normal historical time, leaving me alone in the ruins of a 71-year-old crime scene with no evidence that the massacre had been repeating itself, except for the copper still component that I carried away, and the knowledge that some murders create wounds in time itself that continue bleeding across decades until someone disrupts the patterns that keep past violence alive in the present. The Park Service confiscated my recording equipment and podcast research materials after I reported my experience, and the historical distillery site was permanently closed to researchers and visitors. But I still receive anonymous messages warning me to keep silent about temporal crime scenes and threatening consequences if I continue investigating cases where violence has created breaks in normal time that allow past events to continue affecting the present through mechanisms that law enforcement agencies are not equipped to understand or control. The rare ginseng I'd been harvesting for 3 generations was growing so well because each root was feeding on a human heart buried 6 feet below. My name is Kellen, and I was 61 years old in September of 2021 when I discovered that my family's most profitable ginseng harvesting sites in the Cherokee National Forest had been carefully cultivated by a serial killer who had been using our traditional gathering routes to dispose of his victims for more than 2 decades. Turning my grandfather's legacy of sustainable wild ginseng harvesting into an unknowing partnership with someone who understood that human decomposition creates the perfect soil conditions for growing the most valuable medicinal plants in the Appalachian Mountains. I was a 3rd-generation ginseng hunter who had learned the trade from my grandfather and father. Spending 43 years developing an intimate knowledge of the remote, high-elevation ridges along the North Carolina and Tennessee border, where wild American ginseng grows in the specific microclimate conditions that produce roots valuable enough to make the dangerous and illegal harvesting worth the risk of federal prosecution and the physical dangers of working alone in wilderness areas where a single misstep could result in death from exposure or injury, with no possibility of rescue. Wild ginseng harvesting is both an art and a science that requires generational knowledge of forest ecology, seasonal timing, and the subtle environmental indicators that reveal where the most valuable plants are likely to be growing. In conditions that remain secret from competition and law enforcement agencies that treat ginseng harvesting as a form of poaching that threatens endangered plant populations in national forests, where any form of plant collection is strictly prohibited by federal regulations. My family had been harvesting ginseng in the Cherokee National Forest since the 1940s, developing detailed knowledge of specific locations where the plants grew consistently year after year, creating sustainable harvesting practices that allowed us to collect valuable roots without depleting the wild populations that required decades to reach maturity, and represented one of the few economic opportunities available to mountain families who possessed the specialized knowledge necessary to find and harvest plants that were virtually invisible to anyone. Without extensive experience in identifying the subtle characteristics that distinguished valuable wild ginseng from the dozens of similar-looking plants that shared the same forest habitats. The ginseng patches that my family had been harvesting for more than 70 years were located in remote areas that required hours of difficult hiking through terrain that was deliberately chosen for its inaccessibility to casual hikers or law enforcement patrols. Following unmarked trails and navigating by landmarks that were known only to family members who had been taught the routes through generational knowledge that was more valuable than money and more closely guarded than any other family secrets. These harvesting sites were located at elevations between 3,000 and 4,000 feet, in north-facing coves where the soil conditions, drainage patterns, and forest canopy created the specific microclimates that wild ginseng requires to grow into the large, multi-pronged roots that command premium prices from buyers who export the plants to Asian markets, where American ginseng is valued for medicinal properties that make individual roots worth hundreds or sometimes thousands of dollars, depending on their age, size, and quality characteristics. During the 2021 harvest season, I noticed that several of my family's most productive ginseng patches were producing exceptionally large and healthy plants with root systems that were significantly more developed than what I had come to expect based on decades of experience harvesting in the same locations. With individual plants showing growth patterns that suggested they had access to unusually rich soil nutrients that were promoting accelerated development and enhanced potency that made these particular roots even more valuable than the already premium quality ginseng that had been growing in these locations for generations. The soil in these areas had developed a distinctly different texture and coloration compared to typical forest soil, with a dark, rich composition that was clearly providing enhanced growing conditions for the ginseng plants, but which also had an organic quality that struck me as somehow different from normal forest compost or natural nutrient accumulation. As I carefully harvested the exceptionally valuable ginseng roots from these enhanced growing sites, I began to notice other anomalies that initially seemed like fortunate coincidences but gradually became more disturbing as I recognized patterns that suggested human activity in areas that should have been completely untouched wilderness, where no unauthorized presence should have been possible, given the remote location and difficult access that had kept these harvesting sites secret and protected for 3 generations. I found evidence of recent digging activity that was not related to my ginseng harvesting, including disturbed soil areas that showed signs of systematic excavation and backfilling that had been conducted with tools and techniques that were more sophisticated than anything that would be used for plant collection or normal forest maintenance activities. The first clear indication that something was seriously wrong with my family's traditional harvesting sites came when I discovered human clothing and personal belongings buried in the soil around the most productive ginseng patches. Items that appeared to have been in the ground for varying lengths of time based on their condition and the extent to which plant roots had grown through and around them, suggesting that people had been buried in these locations over a period of many years in a systematic pattern that had enhanced the soil conditions that were producing the unusually large and valuable ginseng roots that had made my recent harvests so profitable. The personal belongings included identification documents that indicated the items belonged to people who had been reported missing over a span of more than 20 years. Mofram, with driver's licenses and credit cards showing names and photographs of individuals whose disappearances had been attributed to hiking accidents or voluntary departures from communities where missing persons cases were often not pursued aggressively by law enforcement agencies that lacked resources for extensive wilderness searches. When I realized that I had been unknowingly harvesting ginseng that was growing in soil enriched by human decomposition, I began a more systematic investigation of my family's traditional harvesting sites and discovered evidence of at least 15 different burial locations where human remains had been deliberately placed to create optimal growing conditions for wild ginseng cultivation, with each burial site carefully selected for its soil characteristics, drainage patterns, and forest canopy conditions that would promote rapid decomposition while providing the specific nutrients that ginseng plants require to develop the large, complex root systems that are most valued by buyers who pay premium prices for plants with documented wild growth characteristics. The horror of my discovery was amplified when I realized that someone had been watching my harvesting activities for years, studying my roots and timing to coordinate their disposal of murder victims with my seasonal ginseng collection schedule, ensuring that the buried bodies would have adequate time to decompose and enrich the soil between my annual visits to each harvesting site. Creating a systematic approach to both murder and ginseng cultivation that used my family's traditional ecological knowledge as an unwitting cover for serial killing that had been continuing for more than 2 decades without detection by law enforcement agencies that had no knowledge of the remote locations where these crimes were being committed. The realization that I was being observed by a killer became undeniable when I began finding fresh evidence of surveillance and preparation at my harvesting sites, including recently constructed observation posts that provided clear sight lines to the areas where I conducted my ginseng collection activities, and newly disturbed soil that indicated recent burial activity timed to coincide with my harvesting schedule, in ways that would ensure optimal decomposition periods for soil enhancement, while minimizing the risk of discovery during my brief annual visits to each location. The killer had developed detailed knowledge of my harvesting patterns and was using this information to coordinate murder and body disposal with scientific precision that maximized both the effectiveness of victim concealment and the agricultural benefits of human decomposition for ginseng cultivation. The most terrifying aspect of this discovery was the understanding that the killer had been manipulating my family's ginseng harvesting activities for years, essentially using us as unknowing partners in a criminal enterprise that combined serial murder with illegal plant harvesting, in ways that made both activities more profitable and less likely to be detected by authorities who might investigate either crime separately but would never suspect the connection between missing persons cases and illegal ginseng operations in remote wilderness areas where human presence was assumed to be minimal and temporary. My confrontation with the killer occurred during what should have been a routine harvesting trip to one of my most productive sites. When I arrived to find him in the process of preparing a fresh burial location adjacent to a ginseng patch that had been producing exceptionally valuable roots for the past 3 years, indicating that he had been using this location for murder and body disposal, while timing his activities to enhance the growing conditions for plants that I would harvest months later, without realizing that their exceptional quality was directly related to the human remains that had been feeding their root systems. The killer was a man in his 50s who possessed extensive knowledge of both forest ecology and human decomposition, enabling him to select murder victims whose body composition and burial timing would produce optimal soil enhancement for ginseng cultivation, while minimizing the risk of discovery by maintaining careful coordination with my harvesting schedule that he had been studying and documenting for years through surveillance activities that had allowed him to predict my movements and timing with scientific accuracy. He explained with calm, matter-of-fact detachment that he had chosen to combine serial murder with ginseng cultivation because both activities required similar skills in forest navigation, soil analysis, and seasonal timing. And because the economic value of enhanced ginseng production provided additional motivation for continued killing that served both psychological and financial purposes that made his criminal activities more sustainable and profitable than conventional serial murder. My survival of this encounter happened only because my extensive knowledge of the forest terrain allowed me to escape through routes that were familiar to me, but unknown to the killer. Despite his years of surveillance and his detailed understanding of my harvesting activities, and I was able to reach areas where cell phone coverage allowed me to contact authorities who ultimately discovered more than 20 burial sites spread across multiple states, representing decades of serial killing that had been enhanced by the killer's scientific approach to using human decomposition for agricultural purposes in remote locations where discovery was unlikely. And the economic benefits of improved plant growth provided additional motivation for continued criminal activity. If you've made it through all 11 of these terrifying true stories from the deepest, darkest corners of Appalachian wilderness, you're now officially part of the Verified Fears family. These accounts represent just a fraction of the disturbing incidents that happen in places where civilization ends and something far more ancient and dangerous takes over. If these stories have left you questioning what's really lurking in the shadows of our world, make sure to subscribe to Verified Fears for more authentic horror that will make you think twice about venturing into the unknown places where human logic doesn't apply, and survival depends on understanding that some things should be left alone.